Whenever you think of stars in the Nintendo universe, you probably think of Mario or Link, or even a Power Star. But there's actually a lesser known star within the Nintendo game library who literally is a star. His name is Starfy, a character of which stars in the self-titled game series Densetsu no Starfy, or in English, Legendary Starfy. If you're unfamiliar with the series or even confused at this point, don't worry. As the Japanese title should suggest, Starfy is a primarily Japanese-only franchise, with 4 of his games being Japan exclusives. The only exception to this is when the Legendary Starfy was released in the US in 2009, as well as Starfy making small cameo appearances in the Super Smash Bros. Series. So while Starfy might not have been too big of a hit in the US, Japan sure got a lot of Starfy. His debut dates back to 2002 when his first game was released on the Game Boy Advance. However, this wasn't actually supposed to be his first game. The previously mentioned debut title, Densetsu no Starfy for Game Boy Advance, originally entered the planning stages in 1995, meaning that in retrospect, Starfy was going to be released for the original Game Boy. Yep, this colorful and fluid game was originally being conceptualized for the clunky black and white Game Boy. At this time, however, Starfy was not the star we know him as today. In fact, he was just a generic entity being pushed through a test maze. Nintendo producer Hitoshi Yamagami had worked on this idea for 6 months only to decide that the concept was boring and it never went anywhere. So after deciding the maze idea was a failure, Yamagami partnered with Toast producer Yasuhiro Minamimoto, from which the original idea was reworked into a floaty platformer and starred a starfish. While the concept of Starfy was decently solidified from this point on, the overall direction of the project changed a bit, and then it went through a trouble period between then and March 1998, of which the project had then started to look like the game we know today. Unfortunately, this is when the Game Boy was being converted over to Game Boy Color, so naturally Nintendo wanted this Game Boy Starfy prototype to be reworked for the newer hardware. And just like that, the Game Boy version of Starfy was dead. If the maze prototype had failed sooner and the team had come up with the idea of Starfy sooner, or if the team never went through that trouble period up until 1998, it's possible Starfy would have made its way onto the original Game Boy as a late release game. So time was really the largest factor that contributed to the Game Boy prototype being revamped for the Game Boy Color. And now this is where things get really interesting. The 2-year work of transferring Starfy from Game Boy to Game Boy Color was finally seen in the year 2000 at a well-known Japanese trade show called Space World. Showcased to the public was both a gameplay trailer as well as a playable demo. The trailer itself showcases downgraded and early characters and levels when compared to the final version of the game, and only the title from an article called Space World 2000 Hands-On The Legend of Starfy from GameSpot.com remain as evidence that the game was indeed playable at one point in time. For as rare and obscure as the trailer is, I had no idea this early build was playable at all, and perhaps that's the true desire to come from all of this early Starfy content, since no one outside of the Space World attendees have ever played this version of the game. Unfortunately though, it's likely going to stay that way, as the chances of a ROM ever finding its way onto the internet are slim to none. There is a scan from the Space World guidebook which showcases Game Boy Color Starfy, and also its original website is still available to check out. In any case, it's pretty odd to think about Nintendo deciding to show a trailer for a soon-to-be outdated game and handheld to the public, especially considering Luigi's Mansion and Super Mario 128 were also shown at the same convention. And it was odd for a reason. In 2000, Nintendo was planning on phasing out the Game Boy Color and preparing for the Game Boy Advance's launch. So contrary to all of this publicity and its on-schedule December 2000 release date, Nintendo had once again told the Starfy team to upgrade the game from Game Boy Color to Game Boy Advance, which means this trailer and the demo were really the last late remnants of the build before the Switch would ultimately be made and the new release date of 2002, which finally did happen. So it's my understanding that from original Game Boy days to final GBA release, the game more or less remained as the same in general idea, but was gradually upgraded to fit each handheld's features, meaning that we truly didn't lose anything Starfy in the process, but that it would have been a different Starfy experience had we been able to play the game on 2 older Nintendo handhelds. No telling what that original maze idea would have become though. I tend to think had it seen fruition, it wouldn't have involved Starfy at all. In fact, I've seen claims of a balloon being the subject of it, so perhaps we would have ended up with an air character instead of a sea character. Regardless of what could have been, what we do have is a pretty awesome underrated Nintendo platforming series that has so much more history behind him and definitely needs more games in the US. But for now, the intrigue behind the mysterious Game Boy and Game Boy Color builds of Starfy will live on.